She hit the ground before anyone could move. Not a stumble, not a trip. Her knees simply stopped working somewhere between the stagecoach step and the Wyoming dirt. And she went down hard, one hand catching the wheel, spoke the other, clutching a carpet bag like it was the last thing on earth that belonged to her. She didn't cry out. She didn't ask for help. She just knelt there in the road with her skirt in the dust and her face turned away from the crowd, breathing like a woman who had already decided she would not be seen breaking. She was already broken. She just hadn't told anyone yet. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel tells the stories that don't get told enough. Before we go any further, please subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. And when you finish watching, drop a comment telling me what city you're in. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming. Let's go back to Amelia Foster. And let's start from the beginning. Carrick Montgomery had been standing outside Harding's General Store for 20 minutes when the stagecoach came around the bend, and in those 20 minutes he had said exactly 4 words, 2 to his horse and 2 to himself, which was about average for a Tuesday. He wasn't a man who filled silence. He was a man who lived in it. The town of Millhaven had gathered the way small towns gather when something worth watching is about to happen. They didn't announce themselves. They just appeared a woman adjusting a display in the milliner's window who hadn't touched that display in weeks. 2 men finding sudden interest in the feed store porch, a cluster of wives near the dry goods who had no particular business being there but plenty of opinions ready to go. Carrick noticed all of it. He noticed everything. He just never commented on any of it, which people around here had long since decided was either wisdom or coldness, and he'd never bothered to correct them either way. He had his hat in both hands. He didn't know why he'd taken it off. He put it back on. "Word is she's from Boston," said a voice to his left. He didn't look over. "That right?" "Society type, they're saying. Fancy education." A pause loaded with implication. "Awful long way to come for a rancher." "Awful long way," Carrick agreed in the tone that meant he was done with the conversation. The stagecoach rocked to a stop. The driver climbed down. The door swung open, and Amelia Foster's knees gave out on the iron step. She went down fast, one hand catching the wheel, spoke the other, holding that carpet bag in a white-knuckled grip, and the crowd made the sound. Crowds make that collective intake that is 1 part concern and 2 parts satisfaction. Carrick was already moving before the sound finished. He covered the distance in 4 steps. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't make a production of it. He simply put himself between her and the audience crouching down to her level and said quietly, "Take your time." She didn't look at him. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was controlled, precise. The voice of a woman who had been practicing being fine for a very long time. "I know you are," he said. "Take your time anyway." She looked up then. Her eyes were gray-green and swollen nearly shut from crying that had clearly been going on long before Wyoming. Her face was blotched from jaw to cheekbone. She had the particular stillness of someone who had wrung themselves completely dry and was now running on nothing but the decision to keep moving. She looked at him for 1 full second. He didn't look away. Didn't look at her with pity. Didn't look at her with the measuring appraisal he'd seen men give women they'd purchased something from. He just looked at her the way he looked at everything straight on without judgment waiting. "You must be Mr. Montgomery," she said. "I am." He stood, extended his hand, not to pull her up, but to offer the difference mattered, and he knew it. "And you don't have to pretend with me." She stared at his hand. "Not today," he said. "Not any day if we can help it." Something moved through her face, fast, almost hidden, like light through a shutter, and then she took his hand and got to her feet, and the moment she was upright, she released him and straightened her spine and lifted her chin and became again the woman who was absolutely fine. But she'd let him see the other one. Just for a second. He picked up her carpet bag from the dirt. She opened her mouth to object. He was already walking. Behind them, Millhaven watched and whispered and assembled its opinions, and Carrick Montgomery did not look back once. TM. The wagon road out to the Double M was rough in October and rougher after rain, and it had rained 2 days ago, which meant the first 10 minutes of the ride were mostly about managing the same rut from 2 different sides of the bench. She didn't speak. He didn't either, which some people found rude and some people found restful, and he had no way of knowing yet which kind she was. When they cleared the worst of the road and the horses found their rhythm, he said, "There's water behind the seat." She reached for it without a word, drank, handed it back. He said, "You eat today." A pause. "On the coach," which meant no, or close enough to it. "There's stew on the back of the stove," he said. "Venison. I made bread this morning." She said nothing. He watched the road. Then she said, "How far is it?" 40 minutes. Maybe less if this road behaves." "And the ranch, how many acres?" He glanced at her sideways. 640. Split between grazing and the north timber. Water source. Creek on the east property line, well beside the house. Winter. Hard, honest. You lose livestock some years if you're not careful. I'm careful. She was quiet, processing. He could feel her deciding something, could feel the particular quality of that silence weighted with a question she hadn't yet committed to asking. She asked it. "Why did you write to the agency?" "I needed someone who understood what a ranch actually is, the work of it." That's a practical answer. It's a practical situation. Most men who write to agencies want something more than a work partner. He kept his eyes on the road. Most men who write to agencies are lonesome and won't say so. I'm lonesome and I'll say so. But what I needed wasn't company. I needed someone who could make a decision at 11 at night when a fence is down and I'm on the far side of the property and there's no time to wait for me. She turned to look at him fully. He felt it. "A partner," she said. "That's the word. And you thought the agency could find you that?" "Your letter told me they already had." Silence again. Then, "What did my letter say that made you think so?" "You wrote that you didn't want to be protected." He let that sit for a moment. Most women write to agencies because they want a home. Stability. Reasonable man. You wrote that you wanted to be useful, that you'd spent enough time feeling like a problem someone else had to solve. He paused. "That told me something." She looked away. Her jaw tightened. "What did it tell you?" she said, and her voice had an edge in it now. Not anger exactly, more like the reflex of someone who had been read accurately and wasn't sure yet whether to be relieved or afraid. "That you were running towards something," he said. "Not just away." A long silence. The horses moved. The road unrolled. The October sky pressed down, enormous and gray and indifferent, in the way Wyoming skies are indifferent, not cruel, just vast, with no particular concern for the small human negotiations happening beneath them. She said, "I need you to understand something." "All right." "Whatever you've been told about me, whatever the agency communicated about my circumstances. They told me your name, your age, your profession, and that you were available for correspondence," he said. "That's all." She stopped. "I didn't ask for more," he said. "Wasn't my business." She stopped again. Reset. "My circumstances are not simple, Mr. Montgomery." "Whose are?" "I mean that there are people who would tell you things about me. If you asked around, things that would make a reasonable man question his decision." He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Are those things true?" She met his eyes. "No." "Then I don't need to hear them." He looked back at the road. "And if someone in town tries to tell me anyway, I'll stop them before they finish." She stared at him. "That's not—" She seemed to be searching for the right word. "That's not a small thing to promise a woman you met 20 minutes ago." "No," he said, "it isn't." "Why would you?" "Because you looked me in the eye and told me the truth," he said simply. That's enough for me to start with." She turned away again. He heard something in her breathing change, a slight unsteadiness quickly controlled. He didn't comment on it. He drove. After a moment, she said very quietly, almost to the road rather than to him, "I cried the entire way from Cheyenne." "I know. I don't usually. You don't have to explain it." "I want to." She paused. "I want you to know it wasn't weakness. It was more that I'd been holding something for a very long time, and the moment I was on that coach and there was nowhere else to go, it—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Let go," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Grief does that. Waits until you're moving and then catches up." She glanced at him. "You sound like you know." "I do." She waited. He didn't elaborate. Not yet. He had his own locked rooms, and he wasn't in the habit of opening them for strangers. But what he'd said was true, and she heard the truth in it, and that was enough for right now. The double M came into view around the last bend, the house first, then the barn, then the long stretch of fence running north toward the timber. She looked at it. He watched her looking. He said, "Porch needs replanking on the west side. Kitchen window frame is warped. I'll fix both before true winter." "I can help," she said. "I know." "I mean it. I'm not offering to be polite." "I didn't think you were." She looked at him again with those gray-green eyes. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Believing me," she said, "before I've proven anything." He brought the wagon to a stop in the yard and set the brake and turned to look at her directly for the first time since they'd left town. "That a problem?" She held his gaze. Something in her face was working, not falling apart, not the way it had on the road outside town, but working like a woman who had built an entire architecture around expecting the worst and was now standing in front of something that didn't fit the blueprint. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. "Fair enough." He climbed down, came around. She was already on the ground by the time he got there, carpet bag in hand, looking at the house like she was committing it to memory. He took the bag from her anyway. Habit. She let him. Also habit maybe, or maybe the beginning of something else. The house had 4 rooms and a kitchen and a wood stove that ran hot once you knew its particular moods, which Carrick did, and she would. He walked her through it without ceremony. She asked where things were, and he told her. She opened drawers and cabinet doors with the direct practicality of a woman making an inventory, not a guest admiring a parlor. He showed her the room at the end of the hall last. "This is yours," he said. She looked at the room. Small, clean. A quilt on the bed in faded red and brown, made a long time ago by hands that weren't his. "We'll marry when you're ready," he said. "Not before. If you decide you'd rather not for any reason, we'll figure something out. But this room is yours. Lock's on the inside." She looked at the lock. Then she looked at him, and for the first time since the stagecoach, the careful, controlled expression cracked open enough that he could see what was underneath it. Not relief exactly. Something rawer than relief. The particular look of someone who has been bracing for impact for so long that the absence of it is almost harder to process than the blow would have been. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Someone who wanted something from me immediately, who had terms." "I have terms," he said. "I told you in the letter. Equal say in ranch decisions. Your name on the deed once we marry. You keep whatever you earn separate from what's mine." She blinked. "You wrote that." "I meant it." "Most men don't." "I'm not most men," he said, not as a boast, just as a fact flat and plain as the Wyoming horizon. "I don't want something I have to take from a person. That's not a partnership. That's just another word for something uglier." She stood very still in the doorway of her room, with the late afternoon light coming through the window and her carpet bag at her feet, and her whole bearing shifting degrees, not all at once, the way ice doesn't melt in a moment, but begins at the edges and works inward, and she said, "All right." "All right," he said. Supper was the stew, the bread, and the particular silence of two people finding the shape of each other's presence across a table. She ate like someone who had been pretending not to be hungry for several days. He noticed, but said nothing. He put more bread on the board and slid it toward her side of the table without comment. She took it without comment. Then she said, "Tell me the real problems, not the house, the ranch." He looked up. "You said water rights," she said. "In your second letter, you mentioned a dispute with the neighboring property. Tell me what's actually happening." He set down his fork. "You read my letters carefully." "I read everything carefully," she said. "It's a habit. Tell me about the water rights." He told her. The creek on the east line, the boundary that had been clear for 15 years until the Alderman family sold their property 18 months ago to a land company out of Denver that had immediately begun disputing the survey markers. 2 hearings at the county level, both inconclusive. A third scheduled for November. "Who represents you at the hearings?" she asked. "I represent myself." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you file written claims or only appear in person?" "Hearings, in person." "Written claims create a record," she said. "They can be appealed and referenced. Verbal testimony can be disputed or simply forgotten by a registrar who has reasons to forget. Written claims can't be unmade." She paused. "I spent 3 years managing correspondence for my father's business before I taught school. I understand how official documents work, how they can be used." Carrick looked at her across the table. She looked back. Not performing competence. Just stating it the way she'd stated everything plainly, without decoration, waiting to see if it would be used against her. "I'll pull everything I have," he said. "Tomorrow, if you want to look at it." "I want to look at it," she said. Outside the wind came up hard, the way October wind comes up in Wyoming, sudden and without apology. The house groaned with it. She glanced toward the window. "First time in real wind?" he asked. "I grew up with Boston harbor storms," she said. "I know what weather is. This is different weather. I'll manage." He almost smiled. He caught it, picked up his coffee instead. "You keep saying that," he said. "I'll manage. Because I will." "I know you will," he said. "I'm starting to think you say it more for yourself than for anyone else." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe I do." And it was the first thing she'd said all evening that cost her something to say. He could hear it, the slight, unguarded quality of it. The sound of a true thing slipping out before the careful part of her could stop it. He didn't make anything of it. He just nodded and refilled his coffee and let it stand as what it was. She stood to clear the plates. He stood to help. She gave him a look that suggested she was about to object, and he took the plates anyway and carried them to the kitchen, and she followed, and they washed up in the kind of silence that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere between the water rights and the second piece of bread. When it was done, he took his hat from the hook by the door. "I'm going to see to the horses," he said. "You should sleep. It was a long journey." She stood in the kitchen with a dishcloth in her hands and said, "Mr. Montgomery." He stopped. "What you said," she said. "At the stagecoach." A pause. "That I didn't have to pretend." He waited. "I've been pretending for a long time," she said. "I'd forgotten what it costs. I didn't realize how much until you said it, and I—" She stopped. "I just wanted you to know it meant something. That's all." Carrick Montgomery stood at the door of his house in the wind sound and the lamplight with a woman behind him who had arrived already broken and hadn't once asked him to fix her, and he thought about all the things a man might say to that. He said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a working day." He went out. The door closed behind him, and inside through the kitchen window, the lamp burned. The way things burn when they have finally, after a very long journey, found a place out of the wind. She didn't sleep. She lay on the bed in the room at the end of the hall, with the quilt pulled to her chin and the wind working at the window frame, and her eyes open in the dark, and she listened to the house settle around her like a stranger learning her name. It wasn't the wind that kept her awake. It wasn't the unfamiliar sounds, or the hard travel, or even the particular ache behind her eyes that came from 2 days of crying she hadn't planned on doing. It was something quieter than any of that. Something she hadn't felt in long enough that she'd stopped expecting to feel it. She felt safe. And that, perversely stubbornly, was exactly what wouldn't let her sleep, because she knew better than to trust it. She had felt safe before. She had felt certain before. She had stood in a schoolroom in Boston with 23 children looking up at her and believed with her whole chest that she had built something that couldn't be taken. She knew how that ended. So she lay in the dark and listened to Carrick Montgomery move around in the barn. She could hear him through the wall, faint but present. The low voice he used with the horses, a sound without words, just tone. And she told herself very firmly that one decent man did not constitute a pattern. She told herself that until somewhere past midnight, when exhaustion finally overruled caution, and she slept. She woke before dawn to the smell of coffee. She found him already at the table with a mug and a ledger open in front of him, writing in the cramped, economical hand of a man who had taught himself bookkeeping out of necessity rather than inclination. He looked up when she came in. He did not comment on the hour or on the fact that she'd dressed and pinned her hair and presented herself like a woman reporting for duty rather than a woman who'd slept badly in a strange house. He just said, "Coffee's on the stove." She poured a cup and sat down across from him and looked at the ledger. "Is that the ranch accounts?" "Water rights file," he said. "What there is of it." He slid it across the table. She pulled it toward her and began to read, and he watched her read the way he watched everything, without interrupting, without explaining, waiting to see what she'd find on her own. She found plenty. "This claim from the Denver company," she said without looking up. "They're arguing the original survey from 1861 used a fixed stone marker that has since shifted. That's what they're arguing." And the county registrar accepted that argument for the first hearing. Alcott. His jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." "Do you have the original survey documentation?" "What's in that file?" She leafed back through the pages, found it, read it twice. Then she set the paper flat on the table with both hands and looked at him and said, "Carrick, this survey was filed in triplicate. The original goes to the county, one copy goes to the state land office in Cheyenne, and one copy stays with the property holder. You have your copy. Have you confirmed the state land office still has theirs?" He was quiet. "Because if the county copy has been altered," she said, "or misplaced, or conveniently unavailable, and if the Denver company has someone at the county level who is motivated to lose paperwork, the state copy is the one that can't be touched without going through the territorial governor's office. Which means it's the only document that matters." He looked at her steadily. "How do you know that?" "My father had a property dispute in '68, she said. "A neighbor tried to claim a quarter of his land using a doctored deed. We won because my father had sent a certified copy of the original deed to the state registry 3 years prior and never told anyone he'd done it." She paused. "I wrote that letter for him. I was 16. Carrick sat back in his chair. She held his gaze. "I'm not telling you I can solve this. I'm telling you that before you go to that November hearing, someone needs to ride to Cheyenne and confirm that state copy exists and is intact. And if it is, you walk into that hearing with a certified reference number and you cite it before Alcott can open his mouth." The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove and the wind. Then Carrick said, "I'll ride to Cheyenne next week." "I'll write you a document to present when you get there," she said. "A formal inquiry citing the original filing date and survey number. It will carry more weight than a verbal request." He looked at her for a long moment. the same way he'd looked at her on the stagecoach step straight on, without flinching, like a man who had made a decision and was now simply confirming it was the right one. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She reached for her coffee. He went back to writing in his ledger. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the particular gray-purple of a Wyoming dawn that doesn't ask permission before it arrives. After a while he said without looking up, "There's a school in town, Millhaven, 1 room. Teacher left in August." She went still. "I'm not saying you have to," he said. "I'm not saying anything, just telling you it's there." She looked at her coffee cup. Something moved through her, complicated and layered the way feelings are when they've been buried long enough to compress. Teaching had not been an abstract profession to her. It had been the thing she was, the place where she made sense. When it was taken, the loss hadn't been just the income or the position or the room above the schoolhouse. It had been the loss of the version of herself that knew what she was for. "How many children?" she said. 17 last I heard. Range of ages. Nobody's teaching them anything right now." She said nothing. "Like I said," he said. "Not a requirement." "I know it's not a requirement." She set her cup down. "I'm thinking." "Take your time." She looked at him. He was writing again, or pretending to, giving her the privacy of his inattention. She had a sudden clear understanding of why he did that. The deliberate way he created space. The way he never pressed, never pushed, never stood too close to something tender. It wasn't indifference. It was the opposite. It was the consideration of a man who knew what it was like to need room. She wanted to ask him about that. She didn't. Not yet. "I'll think about the school," she said. "That's all I asked," he said. The first week passed in the way of all first weeks, awkward at the seams and unexpectedly smooth in the middle, the two of them finding the rhythms of shared space by trial and the particular patience that comes from deciding in advance to extend good faith. He was up before light. So was she. He didn't comment on it. She didn't explain it. They ate breakfast with the ledgers between them, more often than not, and she found errors in the account books that he hadn't noticed, and showed them to him without triumph, and he looked at them for a long time and said, "I'm better with animals than numbers." And she said, "Then I'll do the numbers." And he said, "I figured." And that was that. She met the 2 ranch hands on the 3rd morning. Tom Briggs, who was 40, and taciturn as a fence post, and a younger man, who everyone called Dix, and whose actual name she didn't learn for another 2 weeks. They both looked at her with the careful blankness of men who had been briefed by Carrick to behave, and were not entirely sure what behaving looked like in this particular situation. She solved it by asking Tom about the fence line on the north pasture, which Carrick had mentioned needed inspection before first snow. Tom looked startled, then answered. They talked for 10 minutes about post depth and wire gauge, and by the end of it, he was looking at her the way men who work with their hands look at anyone who understands what they're doing, with a respect that has nothing to do with manners and everything to do with competence. Dix just stared at her the entire time with the open, uncomplicated admiration of a 19-year-old who had never met a woman who knew what wire gauge was. Carrick, standing slightly behind her, said nothing. But she felt it, the thing she was beginning to learn to read in him, the small shift in his posture that meant something without becoming a word. Later, when the hands had gone back to work, she fell into step beside him on the way back to the house and said, "Tom's been with you a long time." 7 years. He's good. He is. Dix is young. He's learning. Who taught him? A pause. Mostly himself. Some me. He came here with nothing and a bad situation at home and asked if there was work. There was. She glanced at him. He was looking at the fence line, not at her. "You do that often," she said. "Do what?" "Give people work when they come with nothing." He was quiet for a moment. When I was 15, he said, my father's ranch was failing. Man named Culliver let us run 60 head on his south pasture through the winter for nothing. Never asked for anything back. Said, he stopped. He said a man who won't do for others when he can doesn't deserve to keep what he's got. She walked beside him and didn't say anything because she understood that some things don't need to be responded to. They just need to be received. It was the end of the second week when the trouble from town arrived, and it arrived the way trouble in small towns always does, dressed as courtesy. She was in the yard rehanging the kitchen window frame, which she had decided to fix herself because waiting for problems to solve themselves was not among her habits when a buggy came up the road and stopped at the gate. 2 women. The one holding the reins was about 60, with a face like a closed fist. The one beside her was younger, softer, wearing an expression of sympathy so perfectly constructed it had to be professional. Miss Foster, said the older one. Mrs. Amelia said. Alderman. A pause timed for impact. Helen Alderman. My family owns the property to your east. Amelia set down her tools. She kept her face even. Mrs. Alderman? We wanted to call, Helen Alderman said in the tone of a woman who has weaponized the social call to welcome you to Millhaven. She looked at the window frame, then at Amelia's hands. We heard Mr. Montgomery's bride had arrived. That's correct. We also heard. Helen Alderman arranged her expression into something that was technically concern. Well, we've had correspondence with some acquaintances in Boston. About you. The younger woman beside her touched Helen's arm. Helen ignored it. Boston is a long way from Wyoming, Amelia said. It is, but news travels. A pause. I feel it's only right that the women of this community know who they're welcoming. Amelia looked at her. Just looked at her. She had practiced the look that didn't flinch and didn't attack the look that simply waited, because she had learned that people like Helen Alderman needed you to either run or fight, and she had decided a long time ago to do neither. Then I imagine, Amelia said, they'll make up their own minds. The things being said are not true, Amelia said. Flat, clear, no heat in it, and anyone who repeats them will find that out when it matters. Helen Alderman's mouth thinned. You're very confident for a woman in your position. What position is that? A silence. A woman, Helen said carefully, who needs this community's goodwill. I need honest work and a fair chance, Amelia said. I've been finding those here just fine. She picked up her tools. Thank you for the call, Mrs. Alderman. I'll tell Mr. Montgomery you came by. She went back to the window frame. The buggy didn't move for a moment. She could feel it, the particular weight of being watched by someone who expected you to waver. She didn't waver. She fit the frame back into the casing and checked the level and didn't look up until she heard the buggy turn and move back down the road. Then she set down the level and breathed. She hadn't told Carrick about Boston. Not all of it. She'd told him enough on the wagon, the man, the accusations, the cost of refusing, but she hadn't told him the specific name. She hadn't told him that the man who destroyed her reputation was named Douglas Harwick, and that Douglas Harwick had cousins in 3 states and business interests in 6, and that she had received a letter 2 weeks before she boarded the westbound coach that said in handwriting she recognized that distance would not be sufficient. She hadn't told Carrick because she hadn't wanted to arrive as a problem. She was starting to understand that she might not have a choice. Carrick found her still in the yard an hour later, the window frame repaired and rehung, and Amelia sitting on the porch step with her hands in her lap and her face doing the thing it did when she was thinking hard about something she hadn't decided yet how to say. He sat down on the step beside her, not close, just beside. He said Helen Alderman came by. You saw? Came back from the north pasture as the buggy was leaving. A pause. What did she want? Amelia looked at the yard. To let me know she'd been writing to people in Boston. He said nothing. She knows things, Amelia said. Or thinks she does. Her family owns the Denver land company that's disputing your water rights. I didn't know that when I arrived. I worked it out from the ledger this week. He was quiet for a moment. Alderman sold to a Denver company. Somebody in Denver is running that company on behalf of somebody else. You think that somebody is still alderman? I think it's possible. She paused. I also think it's possible that Helen Alderman writing to Boston about me and the water rights dispute are two separate things that happen to be happening at the same time. I could be wrong. You don't think you're wrong? She looked at him. No, I don't. He nodded slowly. The way he nodded when he was filing something away, adding it to the careful architecture of what he knew and what he was going to do about it. Then, he said, the man in Boston. She went still. You don't have to tell me, he said. But I want to know if there's something coming, not to manage it for you, so I know what we're dealing with. She sat on the porch step with the October air cooling around them and looked at her own hands and thought about what it cost to say a name out loud when you had been very carefully not saying it for months. Douglas Harwick, she said. He's on the school board. His family has money that goes back to before the revolution. When I refused him, he told anyone who would listen that I had behaved inappropriately with a married parent. It was a lie constructed to be impossible to disprove. She paused. He has business interests in several states, including, I believe, Colorado. Carrick was very still. I received a letter before I left, she said, telling me that distance wouldn't be enough. She looked up at him. I don't know if that's a real threat or a man trying to keep me afraid. I don't know which is worse. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was the same face it always was, controlled quiet, the face of a man who processed things internally before they became words. But she was learning to read the things underneath his face, and what she read right now was not anger at her. It was anger at something else, something specific. He's not going to come here, Carrick said. Men like that don't do their own work. They send letters, and they send money, and they assume that's enough. He paused. It's only enough if nobody pushes back. And you intend to push back. I intend to file our water rights claim in writing, reference the state survey copy, and make it very clear to anyone in this county that this ranch and everyone on it is not a soft target. He said it without heat. Factual. That's not heroics. That's just what needs doing. She looked at him. You're not afraid of him, she said. It wasn't a question. I've been afraid of things worth being afraid of, he said. A man who uses paper and rumor as his weapons doesn't make that list. She sat with that. Then she said carefully, What things have you been afraid of? He looked at the yard. The light was going, the sun pulling itself down behind the western ridge in the slow way of autumn sunsets that take their time as if they understand the value of what they're ending. Losing things I didn't know I still had, he said. It was the most he'd said about himself that wasn't practical. She heard it for what it was, not a door opening, but a door unlocked, left for her to decide whether to push. She didn't push. Not tonight. She said, Tomorrow. Can we work on the Cheyenne documents? He looked back at her. The door closed again gently without being slammed. Yeah, he said. Tomorrow. She stood. He stood. They went inside and the lamp went on in the kitchen window, and outside the dark came down over the double M, the way it always does in Wyoming, completely and without apology, and somehow not frightening at all. The documents took 4 days. Not because the writing was difficult. Amelia had written legal correspondence since she was 16, and the language came back to her the way all true skills come back. Muscle memory dressed as intellect. But because Carrick had 17 years of ranch records stored in 3 different boxes in no particular order, and sorting through them was the kind of work that couldn't be rushed without missing something important. They worked at the kitchen table every evening after supper. He pulled documents and she organized them. He explained the history of each dispute, and she translated that history into the precise formal language that county registrars and territorial offices responded to. He watched her write, and she could feel him watching, not with impatience, but with something closer to the attention a person pays to something they are trying to understand. On the third evening, she looked up from a deed transfer and caught him at it directly. "What?" she said. "Nothing." "You're watching me like you're trying to work something out." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where did you learn to write like that?" "Like what?" "Like every word is load-bearing." She looked at the paper in front of her. "My father said that language is either a tool or decoration. He had no use for decoration." She paused. "Neither do I." "Your father sounds like a practical man." He was. He also had a temper and very fixed opinions about how things should be done, but yes, practical. She dipped the pen again. "He died 4 years ago. My mother 2 years before that. After that it was just me and the school and—" She stopped. "And Boston." He didn't fill the silence. He let her decide how much of it she wanted to say. She decided, "When I lost the position, I had nothing to go back to. No family, no savings worth speaking of, no one who was willing to be seen standing beside me." She kept writing. The cousin who suggested the agency Eleanor, she was the only one. She slipped the address under my door because she didn't want her husband to know she'd helped me. She was afraid of her husband, he said. She was cautious. There's a difference. She finished the sentence she was writing. "Eleanor is not a coward. She's a woman who has learned which battles she can afford to fight. I don't blame her." He said, "Do you blame anyone?" She set down the pen, looked at it. "I blame Harwick," she said. "Cleanly and completely I blame him. I spent some time blaming myself, wondering if I'd handled it differently, if I'd been less direct, if I'd given him something small to appease him without—" She stopped. "But that's the trap, isn't it? The moment you start adjusting yourself to manage a man like that, you've already lost something you don't get back." Carrick said, "Yes." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at the documents. He was looking at the table, and his jaw had the particular set of a man who is speaking from somewhere specific. "Someone managed you that way," she said. Carefully. Not a push. An opening. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Her name was Clara. Before the war. We grew up on neighboring properties. I thought—" He stopped, reorganized. "I thought when I came back we'd pick up where we left off. That's what men tell themselves when they're in the field. That home is a fixed thing. That it waits." She didn't move. "She waited 14 months, he said. Then she wrote to tell me that the man who'd left wasn't the man in her letters anymore. That she could feel it in the writing." He paused. She wasn't wrong. She just didn't know how to say what she actually meant, which was that she'd fallen in love with someone who wasn't carrying what I was carrying. "What were you carrying?" Amelia said. He looked up at her then, direct the way he always was. "Things I saw, things I did. The war doesn't leave you, it just goes quiet sometimes. She needed someone it had left." He picked up his coffee. "I didn't blame her then, I don't now. But it changed how I thought about—" He gestured vaguely. "All of this. What it was reasonable to expect." "So you expected nothing?" "I expected a partnership," he said. "Which is what I wrote in the letter. That wasn't a lesser choice. It was an honest one." She looked at him across the table with the lamplight between them and the document spread like a map of everything he'd built alone. And she thought about what it cost a man to distill his entire capacity for hope into one-word partnership and send it to a stranger in Boston and wait. "It was an honest choice," she said. "I thought so when I read the letter. It's why I wrote back." He looked at her. "I'd had enough of men who wanted me to be something," she said. "Something decorative, something manageable, something that reflected well on them." She held his gaze. "You wrote that you wanted someone who could make decisions alone at 11 at night. I read that and thought there's a man who wants a person, not a performance." Something moved through his face. Not dramatic, just present. The way a shift in weather is present, felt before it's seen. He said, "You're not what I expected either." What did you expect? Someone more. He seemed to be choosing carefully. Diminished. By what happened? I was diminished, she said. For a while. The crying on the stagecoach wasn't only about Boston. It was about not knowing yet who I was going to be on the other side of it. She paused. I think I'm starting to find out. He nodded. Once. The filing away nod. Then he picked up the next document and slid it across to her, and she picked up her pen, and they went back to work. Carrick rode to Cheyenne on a Monday, which left Amelia alone at the ranch with Tom and Dix and the specific quiet of a house whose primary occupant is temporarily absent. She hadn't expected to notice his absence as much as she did. She noticed it the way you notice a sound that has become background not consciously until it stops. The particular quality of the house without him was different. Not worse, just different. Larger in some ways, smaller in others. She filled the time with work, which was not difficult because the ranch had no shortage of it. She rode the fence line with Tom on the second morning. She had not mentioned she could ride, and he had not asked, simply handing her the reins of a bay mare with the efficient courtesy of a man who respected competence and reserved judgment for incompetence, and she'd settled into the saddle with enough ease that he'd nodded once, and they'd ridden without further discussion of the matter. She was fixing a section of fence on the north boundary when she heard the second horse. She knew before she looked up that it wasn't Tom or Dix. She knew from the pace, too measured, too deliberate, the pace of someone approaching rather than arriving. She straightened and turned and shaded her eyes and waited. The man who rode up was about 50, well-dressed for the territory, with the pink-cheeked look of someone who spent most of his time indoors and was uncomfortable about the current exception. He stopped his horse 10 feet from her and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had expected to find someone else. I'm looking for Carrick Montgomery, he said. He's not here, she said. And you are? Amelia Montgomery, she said. It was the first time she'd used the name. They hadn't married yet. Carrick had been precise about that, had not pushed, but she used it now without hesitation and felt the weight of it settle around her like something that fit. The man's expression shifted. His wife. That's correct. He adjusted his hat. Gerald Alcott, he said. County Registrar. She kept her face even. Alcott. The man who had accepted the Denver Company's argument at the first water rights hearing. The man whose name appeared 3 times in Carrick's records, with annotations that Carrick had written in the cramped, careful way of someone trying not to let his frustration show in his handwriting and not entirely succeeding. Mr. Alcott, she said, what can I do for you? I came to speak with Mr. Montgomery about the November hearing, he said. There have been some developments. What kind of developments? He looked at her with the uncertainty of a man who has arrived expecting to speak with one person and is now calculating whether to have the conversation with another. She let him calculate. She crossed her arms and waited with the particular patience of a woman who had learned that waiting was its own form of pressure. The Denver Company has filed a supplementary claim, he said finally, citing new survey evidence, a resurvey conducted last month. Conducted by whom? A firm out of Colorado, Meridian Survey Associates. Hired by the Denver Company. That's correct. So the company disputing the boundary hired the surveyors, who are now providing new evidence in the company's favor, she said. And you're presenting this as a development that requires a conversation. Alcott's pink cheeks went a shade pinker. The filing is proper under county procedure. I'm sure it is, she said. I'm asking about the logic of it, not the procedure. She kept her voice level. Has the original state survey copy been referenced in these proceedings? He hesitated. 1 beat too long. Mr. Alcott, she said, the original survey filed with this property was submitted in triplicate in 1861. The state land office in Cheyenne holds a copy that exists independent of any county record. My husband is in Cheyenne right now, confirming that copy is intact and obtaining a certified reference number. When he returns, we will be submitting a formal written claim citing that reference at the November hearing." She paused. "I imagine any resurvey conducted by a company with a financial interest in the outcome will look somewhat different standing next to a certified state document." The silence was long. Alcott said, "Mrs. Montgomery, tell me something," she said. "The Alderman family. Helen Alderman specifically. Is she known to you socially?" Another hesitation. This one told her everything she needed. "I ask," she said, "because I believe in knowing who is in a room and why. I believe in knowing the shape of a thing before I walk into it. My husband has been operating under the assumption that this is a straightforward property dispute. I want to make sure that assumption is correct." Alcott straightened on his horse. "I conduct my office with full impartiality, Mrs. Montgomery." "I'm sure you do," she said. "I'm simply noting that we intend to make a thorough record at the November hearing. Written submissions, certified documentation, formal notation of all claims and counterclaims." She met his eyes. "The kind of record that becomes very clear when anyone looks at it later." The word later landed the way she intended it to, not as a threat exactly, but as the clear suggestion that someone would in fact be looking. Alcott said he would convey her message to Mr. Montgomery. She said she would convey it herself, "Thank you." He said good day. She said good day. He turned his horse and rode back down the road, and she stood at the fence line and watched him go and felt the specific cold clarity that settles in after a confrontation that has gone the way you needed it to go. And underneath that clarity, quiet, but present, a thread of fear. Because she knew what she'd just done. She had put herself in Alcott's awareness. She had made it clear that she understood the shape of the thing, and men who were operating dishonestly did not respond to that kind of clarity by backing away. They responded by pushing harder. Carrick came back on Thursday, which was 2 days later than she'd expected, and she heard the horse in the yard before she saw him and did not examine too carefully the degree of relief she felt at the sound. He came through the door with dust on him and a leather satchel, and the look of a man who had ridden hard and found what he was looking for. He set the satchel on the table. She was already standing. "It's there," he said. "State copy, intact. I have the certified reference number and a notarized confirmation from the Territorial Land Office." He looked at her. "You were right." "I know," she said. And then immediately Alcott came. He went still. "When?" "Tuesday. He rode out to tell you about a supplementary survey filed by the Denver company. Hired surveyors, their own firm." She paused. "I told him about the Cheyenne copy." He set his hat on the table. "You told him before I was back." "He was here," she said. "I wasn't going to pretend ignorance to a man who came to this property to deliver information designed to rattle us." She held his gaze. "I also asked him about Helen Alderman." Directly. He looked at her for a long moment. She waited for she wasn't sure what. Frustration, maybe. The male reflex to have handled it himself, to have been present for the thing that mattered. She had seen that reflex so many times in Boston that she had catalogued it like a weather pattern. He said, "What did he do when you asked?" "He paused," she said. "One beat too long." He nodded. "So they know each other." Well enough that the pause was involuntary. He pulled out the chair and sat down and looked at the satchel and then at her. "Tell me everything. Start from when he rode up." She told him. All of it in order without editorializing. He listened. The way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, with the focused stillness of a man for whom listening was a skill and not just a courtesy. When she finished, he said, "You told him we'd be making a thorough record." "Yes." "Using the word later." "Yes." He was quiet. She watched him process it, watched him lay it out in his mind, the way he laid out fence line measuring, checking, looking for where the tension would sit. Then he said, "That was the right call." Something in her chest released that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "It was a risk," she said honestly. "Most right calls are." He opened the satchel and laid the certified document on the table. "Now we know what we're dealing with. Alcott is not impartial. The Denver company is a front for alderman money. And they've been assuming I didn't know about the state copy because they've been working the county level only." He looked up. "They weren't expecting you." She looked at the document on the table, at the certified seal, at the number that could not be altered or misplaced or conveniently unavailable. "No one ever expects the person they've decided is a liability," she said. He looked at her with something in his face that she was only now learning to name, not admiration exactly, because admiration implied surprise, and she was beginning to understand that Carrick Montgomery was not a man who was surprised by competence. What it was recognition. The look of a person seeing something that matches what they already believed was there. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "Helen Alderman knowing things about Boston," she said. "And the water rights dispute. I've been thinking about the timing. Harwick has Colorado business interests. The Denver company is an alderman front. It may be coincidence." She paused. "I don't think it's coincidence." The kitchen was very quiet. Carrick said, "You think Harwick has money in the alderman land play?" "I think it's possible," she said. "I think the letter I received telling me distance wouldn't be enough may not have been about me personally. I think it may have been about making sure I didn't arrive here and become useful." Her voice was steady. She had thought this through, had turned it over for 2 days while he was in Cheyenne, had looked at it from every angle she could find. A woman arriving as a burden doesn't look at ledgers, doesn't ask about water rights, doesn't notice that the county registrar hesitates when you say a name. Carrick was very still. "If I'm right," she said, "then this was never only about the water rights. It's about the ranch, all 640 acres. She looked at him. "And they sent the one thing they thought would keep me from being useful. My own past." He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "But I'm not done." She met his eyes. "I came here to be useful, Carrick. I came here because I needed somewhere I could stop pretending to be smaller than I am. I am not going to let Douglas Harwick take that from me again." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight with the certified document between them, and the wind at the window, and the whole weight of what they were walking into settled in the air between them. He said, "Then we don't let him. Not I won't let him. Not I'll handle it. We don't let him." She heard the difference. She had been listening for it without knowing she was listening, and when it came so simply, so without ceremony, that it almost went past her. Almost. She picked up the certified document and read it again from the beginning, and Carrick poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one to her side of the table, and they sat together in the working silence of 2 people who have decided without announcing it which side of something they are standing on. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Neither of them noticed for a long time. The snow that had started quietly that Thursday night did not stop until Saturday morning, which meant the November hearing was 6 days away, and the road to Millhaven was temporarily a thing you negotiated rather than traveled. Carrick didn't seem troubled by this. He moved through the ranch's winter rhythms with the ease of a man who had long since stopped arguing with Wyoming weather, and simply factored it in, the way you factor in. A difficult neighbor, acknowledge it. Work around it, don't waste anger on what won't change. He was up before light checking the livestock. He came in for breakfast with cold on him and ate quickly and went back out. He came in at midday and they worked on the hearing documents and he went back out. He came in at supper and they ate and talked, and the talking had changed in a way that neither of them named grown less careful. The way conversations grow less careful when the people having them have stopped rehearsing. On Saturday morning, the snow stopped, and the sky went the hard, clear blue of a Wyoming winter that has made its point and is now simply waiting. And Amelia put on every layer she owned and went outside and started clearing the path to the barn because it needed doing, and she was tired of looking at it through the window. She heard the door open behind her. "I was going to do that," Carrick said. "I know," she said, and kept shoveling. A pause. Then the sound of him going back inside and coming back out with the second shovel, and they worked from opposite ends toward the middle without discussing it, and met somewhere around the halfway point, and both stopped and looked at each other in the hard winter light. He said, "I need to tell you something." She straightened. She had learned to hear the weight in his voice, the specific quality it took on when he was about to say something that had been waiting for its moment. She waited. "When I wrote to the agency," he said, "I told myself it was practical. A working partnership. I told myself I'd made peace with what that meant, with what I was and wasn't offering." He looked at the shovel in his hands. "I hadn't." She didn't move. "I had made peace with being alone," he said. "That's different. Being alone and being settled are not the same thing, and I'd been treating them like they were." He looked up. "You've been here 6 weeks. I want you to know what that's been." She held very still. "It's been—" He stopped. Tried again. "I come inside and there's someone who already knows what I'm going to say before I say it. Not because I'm predictable, I know I'm predictable, but because you're paying attention. Real attention. The kind that costs something." He paused. "Nobody's paid that kind of attention since before the war." She said, "Carrick, I'm not asking you for anything," he said immediately. "That's not what this is. I've been careful to keep this arrangement at arm's length in my own mind, and I'm starting to think that's not honest. And if there's one thing I've tried to give you since you arrived, it's honesty." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I went to the school." He blinked. "While you were in Cheyenne," she said. "I rode into town and looked at it, the building. I didn't go inside, I didn't have a key, but I stood outside and looked through the window." She paused. "There are still drawings on the board, from the last teacher. Addition problems. One of them is wrong." He stared at her. "I stood there looking at a wrong addition problem on a chalkboard through a cold window, in a town where half the people have already decided what kind of woman I am," she said. "And all I could think was that there are 17 children in this town who are not learning anything, and that wrong answer has been on that board for 3 months." She met his eyes. "I want to teach again. I want it badly enough that it scares me, because the last time I wanted something that much, I lost it, and it nearly finished me." He said, "What does that have to do with—" "It has to do with honesty," she said. "You're being honest with me. I'm being honest with you. I came here telling myself this was a practical arrangement. I have been telling myself that with some dedication." She paused. "It isn't only that. It hasn't been only that for at least 2 weeks, and I am not entirely comfortable with that, because I have very good reasons to be cautious with trust, and exactly 0 experience with a man who does what you do." "What do I do?" he said quietly. "You leave room," she said. "Every time. You say a thing, and then you leave room for me to come to it myself. You don't push. You don't fill every silence. She stopped. "You came around the wagon to her side, and you didn't reach for her hand. You just held it out, and you waited." She shook her head. "Nobody waits." He was very still. I don't know what this is yet," she said. "I know that I look for your lamp when I wake up at night. I know that when Alcott rode up, I thought about what you would do in that situation, and then I did it. Not because I can't think for myself, but because I've started to—" She stopped herself. "Reset. I trust your judgment, and I don't give that easily, and that matters to me. That's what I'm saying." The cleared path stretched between them in the cold, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the hard blue sky pressed down overhead, and Carrick Montgomery looked at the woman who had arrived crying and become, in 6 weeks, without announcement, without ceremony, the most present person in his life. He said, "You should get the key to the school." She blinked. "From the town council," he said. "Henderson runs it. He's a reasonable man. Tell him you're interested in the position. He'll want you by Monday." She stared at him. We have the hearing in 6 days. The documents are ready. We know what we're walking in with. There's nothing left to prepare that we haven't already prepared." He picked up his shovel. "Go get the key, Amelia." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "You're impossible." "I've been told," he said, and went back to shoveling his half of the path. Henderson was, as Carrick had said, a reasonable man. He was also a relieved man, the relief of someone who has been waiting for a solution to present itself, and is trying not to show how desperately. He gave her the key within 20 minutes of her walking through his door and added a small salary and a list of the students' names and ages, with the handwritten notation beside several of them that they were behind where they ought to be, which she understood to be his diplomatic way of saying the situation was worse than the wrong addition problem suggested. She opened the school the following Monday. Carrick drove her into town himself, which she hadn't asked for and didn't argue with. He stopped the wagon outside, looked at the building, looked at her. "You nervous?" he said. "Terrified," she said simply. "Good," he said. "Means it matters." She climbed down, walked to the door, put the key in the lock, stopped with her hand on the latch. She turned around. He was still sitting in the wagon, watching, not leaving until she was inside. That was the thing about him she hadn't been able to catalog yet, the protective instincts that managed to be entirely present without being suffocating. He didn't come to the door. He didn't offer advice. He just sat in the wagon in the cold and waited for her to be ready and would sit there as long as she needed. She opened the door, went in, and behind her, after a moment, she heard the wagon pull away. The first day was chaos, in the particular honest way that first days with children always are. Everyone testing the walls, looking for where the weakness was finding. Instead, a woman who knew exactly where the weakness was, and had already decided there wasn't going to be one. By noon, they had established that Mrs. Montgomery knew mathematics, and expected them to know it too. By mid-afternoon, they had established that she was not unkind, but was not going to be managed. By the time the last child left at 4 o'clock, she was exhausted in the specific physical way of teaching, which is the exhaustion of complete attention, and she stood in the empty room and looked at the chalkboard where she had replaced the wrong addition problem with the right one. She sat down at the teacher's desk. She sat there for a long time. Then she put her head down on her arms and cried, not the broken crying from the stagecoach, not grief, but something else. The release of something that had been dammed up by fear and humiliation for the better part of a year, finally finding its way through, because the thing it had been missing, purpose, identity, the specific self that teaching gave her, had been handed back. She was still sitting there, eyes dry by then, when she heard boots on the porch. The door opened, and Carrick came in with 2 cups of coffee from somewhere, probably Harding's, still warm, and he took one look at her face and set a cup in front of her and pulled a chair around and sat across from her desk. "Good day or bad day?" he said. "Both," she said. "There's a boy named Samuel Briggs, Tom's nephew apparently. Tom mentioned him. Who is 12 years old and cannot read a single word and is furious about it in the way that boys are furious about things they're ashamed of. He sat in the back and dared me to make something of it with his whole posture. What did you do? I didn't make something of it. I paired him with a 9-year-old on a mathematics problem because I could see within 10 minutes that numbers came easier to him than letters. He helped her. He tried not to look like he was proud of it." She wrapped her hands around the coffee. "I'll work on the reading separately. quietly, when the others are occupied. Carrick looked at her. You worked that all out on the first day. It's what you do, she said. You pay attention. He was quiet. The same way you worked out Tom wanted his fences discussed before he trusted me, she said. The same way you figured out that Dix needed work more than he needed wages. She looked at him. You pay attention to people, Carrick. Most people don't know they're doing it, you know. He said, My father told me once that the most expensive thing a man can do is fail to notice what's in front of him. He was right. He had his failures, Carrick said. We all do. He drank his coffee. The hearing is in 5 days. I know. I want to talk about what happens if it doesn't go the way we've planned. She looked at him. You think it won't? I think we've done everything right, he said. I also think Alcott has been doing this longer than we've been planning for it, and he may have moves we haven't anticipated. I want us to have talked about what comes next before we're standing inside it. She sat back. If the certified state document is challenged, it won't be challenged directly. It can't be. But it can be managed around. Alcott can request a continuance. He can claim procedural irregularity with our filing. He can slow the process until the Denver company has time to bring in more pressure from the county level. He paused. I've seen it happen to other men's properties. You win the first argument and find yourself in a new argument before you've finished winning the first one. She thought. Then we don't just win the argument, she said. We make the argument so public that managing around it becomes the more expensive option. He looked at her. The hearing is open, she said. Anyone can attend. If the town of Millhaven watches a county registrar attempt to dismiss a certified territorial document in favor of a survey paid for by the company making the claim. She paused. People notice things, Carrick. Even people who have decided they don't like me. They notice when something is wrong when a thing doesn't add up. You put it in front of them plainly enough, they'll do the arithmetic. You want to make it a public accounting, he said. I want the truth to have an audience, she said, because the truth has been in this file all along, and it's been losing to procedure in closed rooms and men who know each other socially. She met his eyes. Open the room. Let people see. He thought about that for a long time. Then he said, There's another thing. His tone shifted. She noticed it immediately, the specific register that meant he was about to say something difficult. Harwick, he said. She went still. I made some inquiries in Cheyenne, he said. When I was there for the survey copy, I asked about Colorado land interests. Denver company's eastern money coming into Wyoming territory in the last 2 years. He set down his cup. Amelia, Douglas Harwick has invested in 11 properties across 3 territories in the last 4 years through holding companies. The Denver company, the one disputing our water rights, traces back through 2 intermediaries to a land partnership that Harwick has a 30% share in. She sat very quietly. You were right, he said. This was never only about water. She had known it. She had said it. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that the thing she had run from had followed her not as wounded ego, but as deliberate strategy, that Harwick had seen her departure west, and calculated that she would land somewhere and become useful, and had moved to prevent that before she arrived, that was different from suspecting it. He knew I was coming here, she said. I think he made it his business to know. He has money in the Alderman land play. The Aldermans befriended Alcott, and Helen Alderman started writing to Boston the moment she heard I'd arrived. She heard her own voice doing what it did when she was controlling something going flatter, more precise. He built the obstacle before I got here, and I walked right into the town he'd already arranged. You walked into it and immediately started taking it apart, Carrick said. That's the part he didn't account for. She looked at him. He thought you were coming here diminished, Carrick said. He thought you'd arrive broken and stay small and not look too closely at anything. Instead, you arrived. He paused. You arrived, and the first morning you were at the table with the water rights file. She said, He doesn't know you. No. He thought you'd be another version of what he is, she said. A man with property who wants a woman who won't cause problems. He was wrong, Carrick said simply. She picked up her coffee. Her hands were steady. She was aware of this specifically, aware of the fact that she was sitting in a schoolroom. She had unlocked herself in a marriage she had walked into with her eyes open, with her name on a deed and a hearing in 5 days. And a man across the desk from her who had ridden to Cheyenne and asked questions and come back and told her the hard truth without softening it. She was aware of all of it, and what she felt was not the cold dread she'd expected. What she felt was clarity. We go to the hearing, she said. We submit the certified document. We let the room see what Alcott does with it. And whatever move comes next, we answer it. She paused. Together. He looked at her with that straight-on look that didn't flinch and didn't perform. Together, he said. She nodded. She stood up. She picked up the chalk and turned to the board and wrote the next day's lesson at the top, because tomorrow there would be 17 children in this room, and Samuel Briggs would sit in the back, daring her to see him, and she intended to see him plainly and completely, the way she had needed to be seen. Carrick sat in the student's chair across from her desk and finished his coffee and said nothing, which was the thing she had needed most, which she had stopped expecting to receive, which she was slowly, carefully learning to accept as the shape of what their life was becoming. Outside Millhaven went about its business in the early winter dusk, and in the school the lamp burned, and on the board in clear, strong letters, Amelia Montgomery wrote the next thing that needed to be taught. The morning of the hearing, Amelia was up before Carrick. He found her at the kitchen table with the documents laid out in the order they'd agreed on, the certified state copy on top, the original survey underneath, the written claim she'd drafted beneath that. She had her hands around a coffee cup, and she was reading through everything again. Not because she didn't know it, she knew every word by now, had written most of it, but because she was the kind of person who checked her work, and this was the kind of work that needed checking. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She looked up. Coffee's on. I see that. He came in and poured a cup and sat down across from her. You sleep? Some. She turned a page. You? Some, he said. They sat with that shared admission between them, the honesty of two people who had spent the night with the same weight and weren't going to pretend otherwise. He said, "Whatever happens today." I know, she said. I want to say it anyway. She looked up. Whatever happens today, he said. You've already changed this. What you found in those documents. What you put together about Harwick and Alderman. Even if Alcott buries it today, it's on record now. Written. Submitted. It exists. He held her gaze. That's yours. Nobody takes that. She looked at him for a long moment. Let's not let him bury it, she said. No, he said. Let's not. They ate breakfast. They hitched the wagon. They drove to Millhaven in the early winter cold, with the documents in the satchel between them, and the sky the same hard, clear blue it had been since the snow stopped, the kind of sky that makes everything look simple and is lying about that. The county hearing room was on the second floor of the building that housed Millhaven's one lawyer, its postal office, and on the ground floor, a barber shop that had been present longer than any of the other enterprises and would likely outlast them all. The room itself held about 40 people when full. When Carrick and Amelia came up the stairs, it was holding closer to 60. She stopped at the top of the stairs. She hadn't expected 60 people. She had expected the principal's Alcott, the Denver company's representative, whatever lawyer they'd brought in, whatever documentation they intended to deploy. She had expected a closed procedural thing, the kind that happens in the way of small corruptions everywhere quietly, with the vocabulary of legitimacy, in a room where only the interested parties are watching. Instead, Millhaven had turned out. Tom Briggs was there standing against the back wall with his hat in his hands. Dix was beside him. Henderson from the town council. The woman from the milliner's shop who had been adjusting that display the day the stagecoach arrived. Several of the parents from the school. Samuel Briggs, Tom's nephew, sitting in the second row with the rigid posture of a boy who has dressed carefully for something important. She felt Carrick go still beside her. She said quietly, "Did you know they'd be here?" "No," he said. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about the school, about a week and a half of children going home to families, talking the way children talk about the new teacher, about the things she'd said and done, and the way she ran the room. She thought about Tom Briggs watching her ride the fence line without comment, about Dix with his open, unguarded face, about Henderson handing over the key with relief. She had been building something without realizing she was building it. The way you sometimes build the most important things in the ordinary motions of ordinary days, without ceremony or announcement, one true thing at a time. She walked to the front of the room and sat down beside Carrick at the respondents' table, and did not look at Helen Alderman, who was seated across the aisle with two men she didn't recognize, and Gerald Alcott, who was arranging papers at the registrar's table with the careful attention of a man who has spent the night deciding what version of himself to be today. He looked up and saw Amelia. He looked at the room. He looked back at his papers. She watched him make that calculation and felt something settle in her, like a key turning. The hearing opened. The way these things always opened procedurally formally, with Alcott reading the case number and the names of the parties and the nature of the dispute in the flat official voice of a man putting on the costume of impartiality. The Denver company was represented by a lawyer named Fitch, who had the particular groomed confidence of someone flown in from a city specifically to handle something that the locals weren't meant to be able to handle. Fitch presented the supplementary survey first. He was good at it, clear, authoritative, with the kind of language that moves fast enough that you miss the seams. The resurvey showed the boundary marker had shifted. The resurvey showed the creek fell outside the original eastern property line. The resurvey had been conducted by qualified professionals from an established Colorado firm. He said all of this without mentioning that the firm had been hired and paid by the company making the claim. Alcott accepted the survey into the record without comment. Carrick's hand resting on the table tightened once, then relaxed. When Fitch finished, Alcott turned to the respondent's table with the look of a man who expects a short conversation. Carrick said, "I'd like my wife to present our response." A pause moved through the room. Fitch's expression flickered, not much, but enough. Alcott said, "This is irregular." "Is there a rule against it?" Amelia said. Alcott looked at her. She looked back. "There's no rule against it," said a voice from the back of the room. Henderson, clear and dry. "I checked." Another pause. Alcott shuffled his papers. "Proceed," he said. She stood. She had the documents in her hands, and she set them on the table and did not look at them again, because she didn't need to. She had written them. She knew them the way you know something you've made with real care, completely in your bones. On October 12, 1861, she said, the original survey of the Double M Ranch was filed with Millhaven County in triplicate, as required by Wyoming territorial law. The county received one copy. The property holder received one copy. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne received one copy. She paused. "Last week my husband rode to Cheyenne and confirmed that the territorial copy is intact, unaltered, and on record. I have here a certified confirmation from the Territorial Land Office, notarized with the original filing reference number." She picked it up and walked it to Alcott's table and set it in front of him. The creek on the eastern property line of the Double M is documented in that original survey as falling within the property boundary. That documentation exists at the territorial level and cannot be altered at the county level. Fitch said, "The supplementary survey demonstrates that the boundary marker has physically shifted." The supplementary survey, Amelia said, turning to face him directly, was conducted by Meridian Survey Associates of Colorado, hired and paid by your client, the Denver Land Company, which holds a 30% interest, owned by Douglas Harwick of Boston, Massachusetts, who has no disclosed relationship to this county, this territory, or this water rights dispute. She said it the way she said everything, flat and clean. No heat in it, nothing that could be called an attack. Just the shape of the thing laid out for anyone to look at. The territorial confirmation I have just submitted predates the supplementary survey by 18 years and carries the authority of the Territorial Land Office. Under Wyoming territorial statute, a certified territorial document supersedes a county-level challenge. She looked at Alcott. I believe you know that, Mr. Alcott. The room was absolutely quiet. Alcott looked at the certified document in front of him. He looked at Fitch. Fitch was looking at the document too, and something had shifted in the groomed confidence, not gone, but recalculated the way a man recalculates when the ground he was standing on turns out to be a different kind of ground than he thought. Alcott said, I'll need time to review. Of course, Amelia said pleasantly. Review it thoroughly. The reference number at the top will allow you to verify it directly with the territorial office. We can wait. Another pause. She sat down. Carrick beside her said nothing. But she felt it, the thing she had learned to feel, that small shift in posture that present warmth. She felt it and kept her eyes on Alcott and did not allow herself to feel anything yet, because the hearing wasn't over, and men like Alcott didn't fold at the first pressure. They looked for the next angle. She watched him find it. The question of ownership interest in the Denver company, Alcott said, assembling himself, is not a matter within the jurisdiction of this hearing. It speaks to the credibility of the supplementary survey, Amelia said. This is a boundary dispute, not an investigation of business interests. Then let's settle the boundary dispute, she said, with the territorial document, which is what territorial documents exist to do. Fitch stood. He was going to argue procedure. She could see it coming, the request for continuance, the claim of irregularity, the mechanism that Carrick had described, the move that buried things in time rather than truth. Before Fitch could speak, Henderson said from the back of the room, I'd like to know about Douglas Harwick. Fitch stopped. Henderson was not a man who made speeches. He was a council chairman who ran meetings efficiently and went home. But he was standing now with his arms crossed and his face carrying the particular expression of a reasonable man who has been made unreasonable by something specific. If a man in Boston has invested money in a company that is in this room today trying to take water rights from a Millhaven rancher, Henderson said, I think this county has an interest in knowing that. This hearing, Fitch began. This hearing is open to the public, Henderson said. And the public is here. The room moved. Not dramatically, no one stood, no one shouted. But it moved the way rooms move when 40 people adjust their weight in the same direction at the same time, and the direction was not toward Fitch or Alcott or the Denver company's supplementary survey. Alcott sat very still behind his papers. She watched him do the arithmetic, watched him count the room and count what was in front of him and count what it would cost publicly, concretely, in front of Henderson and Tom Briggs and the parents of 17 children and a boy named Samuel, who was sitting in the second row watching everything with the focused attention of a 12-year-old who has decided this matters. Alcott said, The certified territorial document is accepted into the record. Fitch said, We object. Noted. Alcott said. He did not look at Fitch. Under territorial statute, the certified survey on record at the Cheyenne Land Office represents the controlling document in this boundary dispute. The county record cannot supersede a territorial filing. He paused. The supplementary survey submitted by the Denver Land Company is entered into record but does not constitute grounds to override the territorial documentation. A breath moved through the room. This hearing finds in favor of the respondent, Alcott said. The water rights on the eastern property line of the Double M Ranch remain as filed in the original 1861 survey. Fitch was already leaning toward the Denver company's representative, already calculating the appeal, the next move, the new angle. She could see it in his posture. She let him calculate. Some fights were won and then continued. That was the nature of fights. But the record existed now, the written certified public record, and the room had seen it made. That was what couldn't be taken back. Outside in the cold, the town of Millhaven reassembled itself on the plank sidewalk in the shuffling comment-making way of people who have witnessed something and need to process it out loud. She stood with Carrick and let it happen around them, and did not try to manage it. Tom Briggs shook Carrick's hand without saying much. Then he looked at Amelia and nodded once with the specific gravity of a man for whom one nod is equivalent to a speech. Henderson said, "The school," addressing her directly. "You're staying." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and moved on. Samuel Briggs appeared beside her elbow without warning, the way 12-year-olds appear suddenly, as if materialized. He was looking at the building rather than at her, which she understood was the way he managed things that mattered to him. "You knew all that," he said. "All those documents, you knew them." "Yes," she said. "Did you learn that in school?" "Some of it. The rest I learned by doing it." He considered this. "My uncle says you know fence work too." "Some," she said. He finally looked at her sideways, the way boys look at adults they are deciding about. "How do you know that many things?" She thought about it honestly. "I paid attention," she said. "And I didn't let anyone tell me what I was allowed to know." He looked at her for another moment. Then he went back to his uncle, hands in his pockets, with the particular careful dignity of a boy carrying something he isn't ready to put into words yet. She watched him go. Carrick was beside her. He had been beside her through all of it, through Fitch and Alcott and Henderson and Tom's nod present, without being in front of her there, without taking the space she was using. She turned to look at him. "Fitch is going to appeal," she said. "Yes." "We should start drafting the response before he files." "Yes," he said. A pause. "Tomorrow." She looked at him. "Today," he said. "I want to take my wife home." She held his gaze. The word wife had been in legal documents, and Henderson's assumption, and Samuel's uncle's fence conversation. It had been the name she'd used when Alcott arrived at the property, and she had needed to be someone solid. It had been accurate and practical and correct. It had not until this moment, standing outside a hearing room in the cold, with the certified document in the satchel, and 60 people rearranging themselves on the sidewalk, landed the way it landed now. She said, "All right." They married 3 weeks later. Not a ceremony designed for the town. They had given the town enough of their story for the time being, but a quiet thing at the house with Henderson and Tom Briggs as witnesses, and a traveling minister who came through Millhaven every 6 weeks and asked no more questions than were necessary. She stood in the kitchen in her best dress, which was not elaborate, and Carrick stood across from her in a clean shirt and his good boots, and the particular expression of a man who is trying not to show that something is happening inside him and not succeeding entirely. The minister said the words. She said yes. Carrick said yes. Henderson shook their hands. Tom ate 2 pieces of the cake Amelia had made and complimented the bread which she had also made, and that was the reception. That night, after Henderson and Tom had gone home and the house was quiet, she stood on the porch in the cold and looked at the yard and the barn and the fence line running north toward the timber, and Carrick came and stood beside her. She said, "When I stepped off that stagecoach—" "I know," he said. "I thought my life was already over." She paused. "Not dramatically. I didn't think I was going to die. I just thought the version of my life that was worth something was finished. That what came next was just management. Getting through." He said nothing. He was looking at what she was looking at. "I want you to know what it's been," she said. His words from the snowy morning with the shovels. She gave them back to him now deliberately. "These 3 months, what they've been." He turned to look at her. "You didn't save me," she said. "I want to be precise about that. I had already decided I was going to survive this. I had already decided I wasn't going to let Harwick or Boston or any of it take the rest of my life." She met his eyes. But you were the first person in a very long time who made surviving feel like it was worth something. Like there was something on the other side worth getting to. His face did the thing, it did the thing beneath the surface that moved without becoming a word. You pay attention to people, she said. Really pay attention. And when you do, they become... She stopped. They become more themselves. You pay attention to me, and I feel more like myself than I have in years. Her voice was steady. That's not a small thing. I don't have a small word for it. He said, I don't either. She looked at him. I built this place to be alone in, he said. That was deliberate. I built the walls at a distance that felt safe. And then you arrived, and you were at my ledger the next morning, and arguing with me about wire gauge and writing documents that made county registrars sweat, and I... He stopped. Started again. The walls stopped making sense. That's the only way I know how to say it. The thing I had built to keep the distance started to feel like the wrong kind of distance. She was quiet. I don't have Clara's loss anymore, he said. That's what I want you to know. I had carried it as a reason to stay where I was, to keep the arrangement at the arm's length I told myself was wisdom. And then somewhere... He shook his head slightly. Somewhere between the documents and the fence line, and watching you put that wrong answer right on a chalkboard, I stopped carrying it as a reason. It became just what it is, a thing that happened, not the thing that decides everything after. She looked at him for a long moment, in the cold dark with the stars coming out over the Wyoming ridge, hard and clear and impossibly numerous. She said, We're going to be all right. Yes, he said. Harwick will push again. The appeal will come. Helen Alderman is not finished. No, he said. And we'll answer it. Together, he said. She looked at the yard, the cleared path to the barn that they had shoveled from opposite ends, the lamp burning in the kitchen window, the fence line she had ridden with Tom, the property that had her name on the deed now, and had needed that name, she understood, in the same way she had needed to give it. She turned and went inside. He followed. And in the school in Millhaven, a chalkboard held the next day's lesson in her handwriting. And in the second row, a boy named Samuel Briggs would arrive in the morning and sit straight and open a reader for the first time in his life, because someone had paid attention to him in the specific way that changed what a person believed was possible. That was what she did. That was who she was. And no man, not Harwick, not Alcott, not the distance from Boston, not the stagecoach step in the Wyoming dirt, had managed to take it from her. She had carried it all the way west. She had set it down at last exactly where it belonged,